You think you know Jesus. You think you have heard his story 100 times, but almost everything you were taught is a construction. The Bible is not a history book. It is a collection of stories, shaped and reshaped over centuries by people with power, fear, and agendas. What if the miracles you believe in were never meant to be literal? What if the voice you hear in sermons is not the voice of a man, but the voice of generations crafting a message to control hearts and minds? The real Jesus may have been a revolutionary, a teacher, a man challenging the powers of his time, and uncovering him forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about faith, history, and our own beliefs. By the end of this video, you will see Jesus in a way the textbooks and the sermons never dared to show you, and it will change how you think about everything you were taught. The man behind the myth. We start with a simple question. Did Jesus exist as history sees him, or is the image we hold in our minds a creation shaped by centuries of storytelling? Scholars debate the details, yet nearly all agree that a Jewish preacher lived in Galilee. He stirred crowds, challenged authority, and died far too young. This man was not the polished figure of Sunday school or church paintings. He was human, fully human, with doubts, fears, and desires. He argued with leaders, comforted the poor, and spoke with boldness that could be dangerous. Over time, the story of his life began to transform. The miracles, the resurrection, and the perfectly formed teachings were not eyewitness accounts. They were later additions, shaped by storytellers who had motives we rarely consider. History and myth were intertwining, and the real figure was fading into legend. Here is the startling twist. What we think of as history often reflects the needs of those in power. Roman rulers, religious authorities, and early Christian communities each reshaped the story to serve their goals. A man who defied the system became a symbol powerful enough to unify communities and influence behavior. Stories were edited, polished, and amplified. Yet if you look closely, the real figure remains. A man who spoke boldly, lived courageously, and confronted injustice. He is hidden in fragments, contradictions, and whispers within the texts. And this is where the tension lies. Behind every miracle, behind every parable, there is a shadow of the real man. The truth of his life is human, radical, and compelling. If you thought you knew his story, you are about to discover that history and legend are not the same. In the space between them, the real Jesus waits to be uncovered. The Gospel of Power. The four Gospels are the foundation of what most people think they know about Jesus, but here is a question few ask. Were they written by people who actually saw the events unfold, or were they written much later, shaped by agendas? Most historians agree they were not eyewitness accounts. They were crafted decades after the life of Jesus, long after those who knew him had died. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were storytellers, yes, but they were also political actors. Their words were meant to unify communities that were fractured, scattered, and vulnerable. They needed a message that could bind people together, give hope, and enforce a vision of order. In the process, events were edited, stories were omitted, and some teachings were invented. The miracles, the dialogues, even the resurrection, were polished to create a coherent narrative. What we have today is not a transcript of history but a carefully constructed story. You might think the Bible preserves truth. In some ways it does, but it also preserves control. Authority wanted a message that could guide belief, shape morality, and influence behavior. The power of the story became more important than the man behind it. And here is the part that most people miss. The shaping of the Gospels was not a one-time act. It was an ongoing process. Communities debated what to include, what to leave out, and what version of Jesus served their purpose best. This is where the seeds of myth begin to intertwine with history. The figure you recognize from Sunday school is the result of generations of editing and crafting. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize that control was never incidental. It was the point. And that is only the beginning of the story. What comes next is where the miracles themselves start to reveal a different kind of truth, a truth about belief, influence, and the human need to see the divine. Miracles as metaphors. Walking on water, raising the dead, turning water into wine. These are the images that fill our minds when we think of Jesus. They are vivid, dramatic, impossible to forget. But here is a question few dare to ask. What if these events were never meant to be taken literally? Many historians and scholars suggest that these so-called miracles were parables. They were stories designed to convey spiritual truths, lessons about courage, faith, and human potential. The stories were never intended to be a literal record of events, but symbols that could inspire, provoke, and teach. Over time, something curious happened. Metaphor became history. The symbolic acts were transformed into factual accounts. Humanity fell in love with the drama, the awe, the impossibility of it all. People began to ask how it happened, rather than why it was told. The deeper meaning was lost in translation, and the strangeness does not end there. The more these stories were repeated, the more they shaped behavior, belief, and culture. The miracles became anchors of faith, shaping the moral imagination of millions, while the real lessons about courage, justice, and compassion were buried beneath layers of legend. Imagine a world where we read these stories as metaphors first. Imagine if the power of a man walking on water was not in the water, but in the way he challenged fear, doubt, and impossibility itself. That is the hidden truth, the part that most religious traditions quietly ignore. And yet, the story persists. People cling to the literal, and in doing so, they miss a lesson far more radical than any miracle ever claimed to be. Jesus, the revolutionary. The man in Galilee was not a meek carpenter. He was bold, outspoken, and willing to confront power where others bowed in fear. He spoke against the temple authorities, challenged Roman rule, and denounced leaders who exploited the poor. Some scholars describe him as a political revolutionary, a rebel who threatened the system so deeply that the powers of his time had him executed. This was not the passive figure of gentle sermons and Sunday school illustrations. This was a man willing to risk everything to speak truth. If that is true, the peaceful, forgiving Jesus we know today is almost entirely a mask. The real figure was daring, human, and dangerous to those who wanted to preserve the status quo. History softened him, made him gentle, and polished his image so that generations could admire without fear. But why did history need him to be gentle? Why did the story shift from rebellion to serenity? Perhaps it was easier to teach obedience than courage. Perhaps power always prefers symbols that inspire devotion rather than action. And this raises a deeper question. What happens when we separate the myth from the man? What do we learn about courage, conviction, and the cost of speaking truth in a world built to resist it? The revolutionary is still there, hidden beneath layers of legend, waiting for those willing to see beyond the comfortable version, and understanding him this way begins to unravel everything we think we know about faith, morality, and power. The story is no longer just about miracles or teachings. It is about defiance, human courage, and the way truth can threaten empires. And the next chapter shows how even the greatest miracle stories were crafted to serve something far more calculated. The resurrection that wasn't. Rising from the dead, the cornerstone of Christian belief. It is the story that defines faith for billions. It is the image that inspires awe and devotion. But here is a contradiction that rarely gets noticed. The earliest letters of Paul, written only a few decades after Jesus' death, barely mention the resurrection. It is not described in detail, nor is it treated as the centerpiece of his message. The fully formed resurrection story only appears later, after communities polished oral traditions, shaped narratives, and spread tales that blurred history with myth. The story grew in power and drama with each retelling. Think about that for a moment. Faith built on a story that evolved like folklore. Stories that changed depending on who was telling them, where they were, and what they wanted to convey. The resurrection became more than an event. It became a symbol, a narrative shaped to inspire, comfort, and unify believers across time and space. Does that make the story meaningless, or does it make it more human? Perhaps its power lies not in the literal act of rising from the dead, but in what the story represents: hope, transformation, and the possibility of change even when everything seems lost. And here is where it gets deeper. The resurrection is not just a tale of the past. It is an example of how stories shape societies and minds. It shows how belief can be manufactured, how legends grow, and how humans have always needed something larger than themselves to believe in. The miraculous image captivates us, but the truth behind it is far more revealing. It tells us about power, influence, and the human desire to hold on to hope in the face of mortality. And that brings us to the next question: who controlled the story and why? That is where history and power intersect in ways few dare to explore. Who wrote the story, and why? Power has always loved stories, not just stories for entertainment, but stories that shape minds, guide behavior, and secure influence. The story of Jesus is one of the most powerful examples of this. The Roman Empire, Jewish sects, and later Christian leaders all had reasons to shape him into a symbol that served their interests. Each generation edited, emphasized, and sometimes invented parts of the story to reflect their priorities. Miracles, divinity, eternal life, these were not merely spiritual concepts, they were tools of influence, ways to inspire loyalty, obedience, and unity among the people. And we have inherited them as unquestionable truth. We recite the stories, we celebrate the teachings, and we carry forward a version of Jesus that is centuries removed from the man who walked Galilee. The original figure is almost impossible to recognize beneath the layers of rewriting and embellishment. And this is where the story becomes personal. When you begin to see how history was shaped by power, you start to see it in your own life. You realize how beliefs are inherited, how myths are passed down, and how the stories we trust can be shaped to serve others' agendas. The real Jesus is not just a historical figure. He becomes a mirror. He shows us how narratives influence the human heart, how culture can mold perception, and how truth is often hidden beneath layers of desire, fear, and authority. And the next revelation is even more unsettling. The story of Jesus is not just about history or faith. It is about human psychology, about why we need heroes, and about the ways we are willing to believe what makes us comfortable rather than what is real. Why it matters today. Understanding the historical Jesus does not destroy faith, it frees it. It allows us to see belief not as blind acceptance, but as a conversation with reality. It shows us how humans create stories and how those stories shape morality, society, and even the deepest parts of our inner lives. When you strip away the layers of myth and legend, you encounter a man with radical ideas. He spoke courageously, challenged injustice, and lived with a clarity that frightened those in power. He struggled, he doubted, he suffered. He was not perfect, and he was not divine. He was just real. And there is something profoundly inspiring about that. Reality, with all its messiness and imperfection, can teach lessons that no miracle ever could. Courage, conviction, compassion, and defiance exist in real human choices. Those are the things that shape lives. Seeing Jesus as a human being allows us to reclaim him as a teacher for today. Not a distant figure on a pedestal, but a man whose actions, ideas, and struggles speak directly to the challenges we face. It changes how we understand morality, faith, and the cost of standing for truth. And the most important insight is this: myths may comfort us, but reality empowers us. When we embrace the real story, we embrace our own ability to question, to challenge, and to live with integrity in a world that often prefers conformity. The life of the real Jesus, stripped of legend, does not leave us with emptiness. It leaves us with possibility. It leaves us with courage. It leaves us with truth. So the next time someone tells you they know Jesus, ask, do you know the man or the myth? History doesn't erase belief, it deepens understanding. The stories we inherit aren't lies, they're reflections of our need for meaning. But when we see the world as it is, we reclaim our power to think, question, and live honestly. The real story of Jesus isn't written in stone, it's discovered in the space between myth and truth. If you want to keep questioning what you were taught, to look past comfort and tradition, stay curious. And if this changed the way you see faith, life, or history, subscribe, because the search for truth doesn't end with a book, it begins with a question.